What's up, everybody? This is Harry Bernard Taylor with the Straight Up Wrestling Show, and I'm here today to talk about my favorite wrestler. A lot of people look at him as the greatest wrestler of all time. I definitely do, and I'm gonna go over a few things about this man. And this man, his name is Ric Flair. As you can see, I have a little bit of paraphernalia behind me. I have his wrestling magazine. I have one of his VCR tapes, VHS tapes, from when he was WCW. So bought this back in what, 99, 2000, year 2000 or something like that. I think WCW put this out on the Nature Boy Ric Flair. There's a lot of other things that I have of Ric Flair, but right now I'm not gonna go and pick up those things, look for those items or anything like that. But right now I'm just gonna talk about my favorite wrestler, the Nature Boy Ric Flair, and I'm gonna go over some of the things that happened to make me become a huge fan of Ric Flair. And I mean, I can go all the way back. I mean, it goes a long way back, So pretty much close to 50 years. I mean, 40, 47, 48 years. I say 47 years ago is when I became a huge fan of the Nature Boy Ric Flair, and that was a long time ago. I was a kid. This was in the 70s, and I will tell you the story of how that happened. But right now, this video right here is called "The Man That Helped Build the Nature Boy Ric Flair." Now, there was a lot of people involved in building Ric Flair. I mean, Ric Flair, yes, has all the talent, has the tools, knows how to rock the microphone to get over with people. Knows how to, he knew how to be the greatest. He was the best heel probably ever. Knew how to rile up the fans, and even when he, ran as a fan favorite, he did have some runs as a fan favorite. He got over that way too. But nothing can compare to when he was a heel and that heel run that he had all those years. I mean, he did it, and he did it in what, like 4 or 5 decades? I think, 4 or 5 decades that he did that, man. And I mean, just spectacular the majority of the time that he did wrestle. So let's go back to the beginning. We all know that he started off in 1972 in Vern Gagne's AWA Championship Wrestling. That's where he started, up there in Minnesota. That's where he's actually from. Minnesota. And AWA, they ran out, in the Midwest, of the United States. Then in 1974, he came to the territory. He came to where I live. He came into my area of the country. I'm from Greenville, South Carolina, and we had Crockett Promotions here. Jim Crockett Promotions, and we had there was a regional territory called the Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling territory. Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling. Most people look at Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, that region as the best region ever, the best territory ever. And that Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling region, it went to the Jim Crockett Promotions, basically taking over the NWA and basically becoming the NWA. And then it converted on over to WCW, and then which was bought out by Ted Turner. So, but Ric Flair, definitely probably the main player outside of Jim Crockett. Jim Crockett Sr., who started it, and Jim Crockett Jr., it was Ric Flair who built WCW, who built Jim Crockett Promotions, who built NWA, WCW to what it was. So I can't say he really built the NWA, because that was built from a lot of different wrestlers. I can't take away from what Luthez did. I can't take away from Harley Race, Jack Briscoe, Terry Funk, Dory Funk Jr., Killer Kowalski. Some of these guys, man, that was greats in the NWA. Gene Kiniski, people like that that built the NWA into the power that it was. I can't take away from those people, but Ric Flair definitely came and became like the biggest star. So I also got to give Dusty Rhodes props in that, which I didn't name him, but Dusty Rhodes, and then all the great tag teams and everything. So, but Nature Boy Ric Flair, man, let's get on to the Nature Boy Ric Flair. I'm talking about the man that built the Nature Boy Ric Flair, and there was a lot of people surrounding him that made him great. First off, let's talk about the feuds. Now, Nature Boy Ric Flair, he is a who's who of feuds that this man ended up being in. I mean, and that's one thing about it. You try to make a great wrestler. You try to make a great wrestler today, and trying to make a wrestler who can surpass what Ric Flair did. You have to have the opponents to put that man over to be able to be ranked where somebody like Ric Flair is. And so let's go ahead and talk about the feuds. The first feud I remember was against Chief Wahoo McDaniel. I was at the Greenville Memorial Auditorium. I was 8 years old. I was with my family, with my grandmother and with my grandma, and I think let's see, I was with my grandma, my uncle, and three of my aunts. We was at the Greenville Auditorium. I think this was in 1975. I was 8 years old. Okay, we used to watch wrestling on the weekends. Watch Channel 4. We watched Mid Atlantic Championship Wrestling, and every Saturday morning. I think it was at 11 o'clock when we started. I think it came on at 11 o'clock, or maybe it was 12 o'clock. But we used to watch Mid Atlantic Championship Wrestling, and mainly everybody in the neighborhood. My family in the neighborhood, we all cheered for the good guys, the fan favorites. That's who we mainly cheered, and you booed the heels, you booed the bad guy. So Ric Flair was a bad guy. Now Ric Flair at this time, I knew of Ric Flair. I mean, Ric Flair was teaming up with Rip Hawk. I remember Ric Flair teaming up with Rip Hawk, and they had blonde hair. Ric Flair was kind of like burly, kind of big or whatever. And I used to look at him. I'm saying, they pretty good. And Ric Flair was a young guy. I'm like, looking at him, he was a young guy. But Rip Hawk, man, Rip Hawk, looked like he was a short dude, kind of like mean looking, like a mean man. I mean, they could really fight. And this Ric Flair just was, he was a brash kid at that time, kind of like cocky and everything. But, I'm looking at him, didn't really think anything of it. I thought this guy had the potential to be a star, but, the way he looked and all that, I didn't really think he had all that. And I think this was around 1974, and I was watching this. Already had been watching wrestling. I think I started watching wrestling like 72, 73 at 5 or 6 years old with my brother. He used to be watching this stuff on TV, and I'm sitting, turning around, looking at it. And so, I knew some of the wrestlers. I'm not going to name their names because I'm going to stay on this Ric Flair thing. But Ric Flair had got into a plane wreck, I think, in 75. I mean, he was wrestling and mainly wrestling with Rip Hawk and things like that. Then he started teaming with Johnny Valentine and people like that. And, he was doing things. But still, I really wasn't paying a whole lot of attention to Ric Flair. I remember when he used to be calling him out, saying he was a young lion and all that. And, and he's wrestling and he's looking pretty good. So I'm checking this guy out. But he was in a plane wreck. He was in a plane crash with it was him, David Crockett, Johnny Valentine, and I think Mr. Wrestling, Tim Woods. All of those guys was in this plane crash. So I mean, I'm young. I really didn't know anything about it. So plane crash. I'm thinking these guys gonna come back. They ain't gonna come back. They're gonna be dead or whatever. But Ric Flair came back after this plane crash. Which broke his back. Ric Flair was fine, and Ric Flair came in. He was took him a little while. He had to rehab and all that. But when he came back, they had changed his persona. They changed his persona, changed who he was. But he was still Ric Flair, but the Nature Boy was added on to Ric Flair. And I remember when he's on TV, the Nature Boy Ric Flair. I'm like, oh wow, the Nature Boy. That sounds pretty good. But still, nobody liked him. I didn't like him. I didn't like. I mean, he seemed like a mean guy. On TV bragging, talking all this mess and everything about what he was gonna do. Everybody loved Chief Wahoo McDaniel, the Indian, the old Indian man. I mean, deliver these mean chops. Everybody loved Chief Wahoo McDaniel. For some reason, I just really couldn't get into him that much. And it's maybe because back then, man, I would play, back then we played with our cowboy and Indians. We played with our army man and things like that. We didn't have electronics and all these things, in the video games. We didn't have all that stuff that the kids have today. So, I'm sitting there, I'm playing with all these things. And so I kind of looked at Indians. In a certain way as kind of like, these people are bad or whatever. Because, my grandmother, she loved Westerns. So a lot of the Westerns. So, they portrayed a lot of times the Indians as bad people, as bad guys. even though I didn't think all of them was bad, but certain ones I did. And Chief Wahoo McDaniel seemed like a mean Indian. I mean, I remember the first match I saw him wrestle on TV, and I think he was wrestling Boris Malenko. It might not have been the first match, but the first match that I really paid attention to. It's the first wrestling match I really paid attention to, and I think I was 6 or 7 years old. And he knocked Boris Malenko's teeth out of his mouth. He chopped him so hard. I was like, wow. So this guy seemed very vicious, very mean to me. So I really didn't like him that much, even though everybody loved him. We at the Greenwood Memorial Auditorium one Monday night, because we used to go on Monday nights, every Monday night. That's when the regional territories, you had like the Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, I think every Monday night was at Greenwood Memorial Auditorium in South Carolina. Then it was at the Greenwood Civic Center on Tuesday nights. That's in up the road, not too far. Then I think on Wednesday nights or Thursday nights, they was in Spartanburg, South Carolina. Then they come back down Thursday or Friday, and I think Thursday, maybe they was in Roanoke, Virginia, because they was really big in Virginia. They was in Roanoke, Virginia, and then I think they went to Raleigh, North Carolina, then back to Greensboro and Charlotte on the weekend, Friday and Saturday, because Greensboro was they biggest, that was the biggest arena that they went into in Charlotte. But those Greensboro back then had an arena that held over 16,000 people. It was almost a 17,000 seat arena. So they used to go into that, and that was the big show. And Jim Crockett, routinely sold that thing out. So man, that was a great arena for them to go to. But they was at the Greenville Auditorium. This Monday night, and Greenville Auditorium held between 6,500, 7,000 people, something like that. But we sold it out all the time. People used to sit out in the aisles. You would have to sit out into the aisles sometimes. You couldn't get a seat. But this thing used to sell out all the time. Everybody, I remember this match, Ric Flair against Chief Wahoo McDaniel. And man, people booing Ric Flair like crazy. He's doing all these cheating tactics and everything. And everybody just fussing at the referee. You blind referee, you can't see. Ric Flair just cheating. Wahoo McDaniel just beating the crap out of him. Then they get outside the ring. Ric Flair grabs a 2x4, knocked the living daylights out of Chief Wahoo McDaniel. And Ric Flair at that time, his lungs was very strong. Back in the 70s, man, if you get, go back and look at the old film of him, or you get to hear some interviews of him when he was really young, when he was in his 20s, his lung capacity was a lot higher. And I think maybe y'all are drinking and everything like that lowered that. Back in the 80s, he just couldn't, he was still hitting them pretty loud, but nowhere near as he did back in the 70s when he was younger, man. That thing was loud. And man, he let off a woo in Greenwood Auditorium. Woo! People just, and man, people got pissed off. People were just, that even made people even more angry. But there's this big smile that came across my face. I couldn't help it. I saw a superstar. And I'm looking at this guy, and I mean, even though he just had hit Wahoo McDaniel with that 2x4, and I saw the things that he was doing in the ring, man, outstanding. Even though a lot of things he was doing was illegal tactics. Hit him with that 2x4. Big smile came on my face. Man, I couldn't help. My aunt Jackie, she seen that. She was the first one seen it. Turned around, took a look at me, and was, man, what are you doing? My other aunt, my Aunt Tonky, turned around, called it. My Aunt Jeannie, my Uncle Milton, and my grandmother, they all looked at me, and they started talking to me. What are you doing? What are you doing? And my Aunt Jackie, like, you like him, don't you? I'm like, no, I don't. Because people in the crowd, people that was around us in that area, started turning around looking at me, man. I'm just a little kid. I'm thinking everybody in that section just gonna beat the living daylights out of me, man. I mean, I'm just like, and I'm just saying, no, I don't like him. I don't like him. I don't like him. I said, I'm pretty much,
sorry, I can't.
it was pretty wild. I'm pretty much defending myself. I'm like, no, I don't. I don't like him. But man, so like I say, my smile just went to like, just basically stone face. I guess I learned how to use a poker face at that time. But man, I was beaming inside. I was beaming with, happy and excited inside about this rule breaker, about this nature boy Ric Flair. And then I seen him that Saturday on TV. I wanted to have a smile on my face. It popped up again. You know, my family started arguing, started fussing at me. You know, I'm with my grandma at my grandma's house because I used to go every weekend. They started fussing at me again about it. And, you know, I'm trying to defend myself. I go to school that Monday. All the kids are talking about Nature Boy Ric Flair. I mean, you know, at least all the boys and some girls, because a lot of kids, man, wrestling was that big. All the kids talking about it. You know, we out on the playground, and man, you know, and all these kids talking about all their favorite wrestlers. And, you know, they found out I like the Nature Boy Ric Flair because, man, we up there wrestling in the yard. I'm using some of his moves and things like that. And they asked me, did I like Ric Flair? I'm like, and I couldn't deny it. You know, I couldn't deny it. It was all over me. So, yes, told them, yes. And people, man, these kids just went flipping nuts. Just went flipping nuts. And then telling everybody, man, not just in my class. We at Serene Elementary School, we had like 500 students. And I was in 4th grade, I think. What grade was I in at the time? No, I was really 8th grade. I was like 3rd grade. Went around telling everybody. The whole 3rd grade ended up knowing about this, man. You know, Harry likes Ric Flair. Harry likes Ric Flair. Harry likes Ric Flair. It went all over the flipping place, man. And you know, and I'm just like, at first, like I'm denying it. Then I just started defending him. You know, because he was just that great. But let's go ahead and get into these feuds, man. The first feud, like I said, I saw him against Wahoo McDaniel. First time I saw him live, he used a 2x4 on Wahoo McDaniel. Then he used some brass knucks. He was always cheating, but he was always winning. Okay. And during those years, you know, when he was wrestling Wahoo McDaniel, he had other feuds in between those. In between that feud, he wrestled other great wrestlers. And that's what made him so great. And, man, he got nationwide notice because of this feud with Chief Wahoo McDaniel, who was already nationally known. And so that was a great way to start. Around 1976, I think 1976, 1977, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat came into the Mid-Atlantic area. Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, he was big out in Florida. Came into the Mid-Atlantic Championship area, and Ricky Steamboat, good-looking guy and all that, started drawing all the women who Ric Flair used to have all the women swooning over him in not WCW, in the Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling area. Ricky Steamboat started taking from that. So, you know, Ric Flair, he got a little jealous. He said, you know, that's what he was believing anyway, that he was taking away from it, taking the shine off of him as being the most handsome man in the Mid-Atlantic Championship area. He didn't like that. So him and Ricky Steamboat started a vicious feud. I didn't think nothing can get as vicious as him and Chief Wahoo McDaniel, but that thing got just as vicious and more bloody. It was unbelievable. And I know they had a lot of people are remembering when, you know, he won the title from Ric Flair, when Ricky Steamboat won the title from him in the late 80s, like in 89, 90, when they had their feud there. And, you know, and they had a series of matches, probably the greatest matches of all time. It was a 3-series match. One of them was like a 2 out of 3 falls match. And those 2 of those matches probably the greatest of all time. But, you know, back in the 70s, and Ric Flair says this himself, he believed they had matches that was comparable or better than those. And I believe so, too. They had some great matches back in the 70s. Hottest feud that I ever seen. It was outstanding. I mean, outstanding. And I mean, very vicious, very hard hitting. And, man, I thought Flair was going to end Ricky Steamboat's career on several occasions, man, because he was just that vicious. It's not that he was a better wrestler, because I think Ricky Steamboat was a better wrestler, and I really liked Ricky Steamboat, and he was my second favorite wrestler. And sometimes in those matches, he was my favorite wrestler with Ric Flair, because I thought Ric Flair was going over the top with some of the things that he did to Ricky Steamboat. But I love Ricky Steamboat, man. I love him. Next, the Anderson brothers. He started feuding with the Anderson brothers. Although kayfabe, you know, they was cousins. And I didn't like this at all. I'm like, why are these cousins are putting their dirt on TV? Why in the world are they wrestling each other? And Ric Flair, he teamed up with Greg Valentine to take on Ole and Gene Anderson. Ole and Gene Anderson, to me, greatest tag team ever. These guys, the Minnesota Wrecking Crew, awesome, outstanding. And I know when they started the Minnesota Wrecking Crew, they started this with Lars Anderson. Lars Anderson, I think, is the one. Yeah, he's the one who started the thing. And then you got his brothers, Ole and Arn. I mean, Ole and Gene Anderson, man. But these Anderson brothers was vicious, and they ended up in a feud with Ric Flair and Greg the Hammer Valentine. Greg the Hammer Valentine and Ric Flair. If you ask me, if they would have stuck together, I would be naming them. I think they would have been the #1 tag team. If they would have did a 2-year run, or 1 year, even a 1-year run, they were only together a few months, they would have been the best tag team ever. These guys was devastating to watch. I mean, great tag team. Ric Flair, he always just pretty much, he doesn't give it the props that it deserves. He doesn't give himself his just due. He says mostly Greg did everything in the tag team. He didn't do much. But Ric Flair was an outstanding tag team wrestler. Even though I think he didn't like that, Ric Flair wanted to shine as a solo wrestler, and he did. So, but that right there, man, was a dynamic feud. So, the Anderson brothers, number 3 on this feud list. Next great feud was the man I'm just talking about, Ric Flair's partner. Him and Greg the Hammer Valentine had a vicious feud back in like 78, 79. Right after that, it was in 78. Right after he had teamed up, they had teamed up together and was beating up the Anderson brothers, and pretty much had a violent feud with the Anderson brothers. Sometimes the Anderson brothers would beat them up. But man, talking about a violent, that was a violent feud. But those two, Ric Flair and Greg the Hammer Valentine, knew each other well. Both of them were similar to each other, man, and that was a violent feud. Then we had a man named Roddy Piper who came in around 1979 into the Mid-Atlantic Championship area, and great wrestler. And him and Ric Flair ended up, now Roddy Piper came in as a heel, but him and Ric Flair ended up getting into a feud, and that was a great feud. As they got into a feud later on, and when Roddy Piper went ahead and changed his, he changed and became a fan favorite there for a little while. Then we had, and then the feud with Dusty Rhodes. Now, most of the feud with Dusty Rhodes, his early feud, it was handled outside of the Mid-Atlantic Championship area. It was handled in other NWA territories. It was handled down in Florida, Georgia, and places like that, sometimes in the Carolinas. But it was all over the place. Up there in Missouri, it was all over the place in the NWA when he was battling Dusty Rhodes. So that right there, the 6th biggest feud I think that he had that helped build the Nature Boy Ric Flair. Harley Race, number 7. Harley Race, that thing started in like 81. Ric Flair was wrestling for the World Heavyweight Championship. Ric Flair, I always thought, probably should have had got the title a little bit earlier than that, even though, like I say, he was winning the United States Heavyweight Championship in like 78, 79. This guy was just outstanding, and I'm like, it was inevitable for him, to be the World Heavyweight Champion. But Harley Race was such a great champion. It was hard to see that this man getting beat, but Ric Flair was so popular, outside of Andre the Giant and Dusty Rhodes, he was the most popular wrestler in the world, and maybe Mil Mascaras, got to throw him in there too. But let's go ahead and go with Harley Race as the number 7, the 7th biggest feud that Ric Flair was in. So right now, I'm talking about the man that helped build the Nature Boy Ric Flair. And right now, I'm in the feuds. So if you like what you're hearing, hit that like, share, join. If you on Facebook, you on YouTube, hit that like, share, join, hit that notification bell, share this, just like on Facebook, share this so people can hear this. But definitely, but let me go ahead and go over these feuds again, man. The number one feud that I think Ric Flair, that helped build Ric Flair. I'm just not saying these are number one. I'm going to take that back, that these are not in order of the number one feuds. These are the feuds in order of that I saw him go in his career for when he started rising to the top. The first feud was against Wahoo McDaniel, and that happened in the mid 70s. And Ricky Steamboat was the second major feud he had. Then the Anderson brothers was the third major feud that he had. Number 4 major feud was Greg the Hammer Valentine. The number 5 major feud he had was with Roddy Piper. The number 6 major feud he had was with Dusty Rhodes. The number 7 major feud he had was with Harley Race. So let's move on, man, to number 8. This is number 8 biggest feud that he had, and this right here started in the early 80s. I say around 1980, 81, or something like that. Was with David Kerry and Kevin Von Erich. David, Kerry, and Kevin Von Erich. And I think around 1981 is when he started the feud with the Von Erichs. And David Von Erich was probably his best, most competitive out of the Von Erichs. David Von Erich, a tall guy, tall, kind of lanky, body wasn't all the way there yet, but pretty solid, but very tough competitor. And I mean, he gave Ric Flair some outstanding matches. Kerry Von Erich next. Kerry Von Erich, outstanding matches. Ric Flair actually took the title from Ric Flair at one time. Kevin Von Erich. Kevin gave Ric Flair some outstanding matches. Ric Flair used to hate to go down to Texas because he knew he had to run into those Von Erichs, and they gave him a tough time. So, I'm thinking one of the Von Erichs is going to be the world champion. I actually did 100%. But Ric Flair, pretty much, Ric Flair, he overcame those guys. The number nine feud that he's had that put him out there and help raise him even more in the spotlight was against Nikita Koloff. Nikita Koloff was over in Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling. Nikita Koloff was running roughshod, and Nikita Koloff, he clotheslined David Crockett. Ric Flair, a big fan of the Crockett's. Ric Flair went crazy. Came back. He had a run as a fan favorite, and Ric Flair and Nikita Koloff went on a great, had a great little series there of matches, and that was a very good feud. And Ric Flair actually overcame, and I thought the Russian was going to take him out. Nikita Koloff is a bull, strong, powerful, very fast, very intense. I thought was going to take out the Nature Boy Ric Flair, but that did not happen. So that right there is just something else that propelled his greatness, man, just unbelievable. The next feud was against Tully Blanchard. Tully Blanchard, around 1984, 1983, 1984. It's 1984. Tully Blanchard was over in the Mid-Atlantic Championship area. Jim Crockett Promotions, even in the Carolinas, Virginia. He came down with his Perfect 10 baby doll. Ric Flair will come, Tully Blanchard would, he wear nice, decent suits and things like that. And out there talking, and he would compare himself. He would say that, what he was wearing was comparable to Ric Flair. And, I'm not, he was basically saying it's not the top quality, what Ric Flair was saying. But he was saying you have to admit that this class is just as good. But Ric Flair would pick on him about what he was wearing and that he wasn't in the same league that he was and all that. And Ric Flair would just basically wanted to slap Tully around. And him and Tully ended up getting into it, ended up, feuding with each other. So it was very shocking to me because they didn't feud that long, but they feuded a couple months or whatever, 5, 6 weeks, maybe 2 months. But they had some feuds and they had some matches against each other. Then next thing you know, Tully Blanchard and Ric Flair teaming together. They in a group together. The Four Horsemen shocked the living daylights out of me because Ric Flair was wrestling. I think he was going against Nikita Koloff, or was it Magnum TA, and Tully Blanchard outside the ring. And Ric Flair knocked somebody outside the ring, and he said, "Get him, Tully." And Tully looking around, and then Tully just started laying the bombs on this dude, man. Just laying the hammer on him, forearms. And I'm like, what in the world's going on? Because, Rick was just the week before, Rick was, up there picking on Tully about his clothes and, and slapping him, slapped him and everything. And him and Tully, going at each other. Next thing you know, man, they done joined forces with each other. So that was very shocking. But that feud right there, man, was a huge feud. And the next feud, man, was against Magnum TA. This right here should have been something that elevated on the level of him and Sting. That's where him and Ricky Steamboat. That's where that feud should have went. But Magnum TA ended up having that car wreck. That right there derailed everything. And I don't even really know if he would have continued on with a feud with Flair, because I think it would have came back to that. But what a lot of people don't forget, now he had that feud with Flair. It didn't work out the way the way they was portraying it, because they said Magnum TA was going to be the champion and everything like that. It didn't come out that way. Flair went on a feud with Magnum TA that went on. This thing went on maybe 2 to 3 months or whatever, and Ric Flair prevailed over him, and he was not the draw, or he was not the big. He didn't come out the biggest competitor during this feud. So Nikita Koloff ended up in a, I mean not Nikita, Magnum TA ended up in a feud with Nikita Koloff that derailed that feud. That went into that, and Nikita Koloff ended up winning that feud against Magnum TA. But then Magnum TA, I think Magnum ended up teaming with Dusty and all that, and I think he was about to go back into a feud with the Nature Boy Ric Flair. But in my opinion, I don't think he would have overcame what Ric Flair was. I just don't think it would have happened. That's just me. I know a lot of people sit there and say, "Oh, Magnum this, Magnum that," and there's a lot of times it's younger people. I'm in my 50s. I'm in my mid 50s. But I have a lot of friends and stuff like that. Most people that I'm around, they like 45, in the mid 40s or whatever. Most people, wrestling fans that I hang out with, or some of them, and they say, "Oh, I heard that Magnum was going to be the champion." Or they came along. They was very young when Magnum was around, but I was a teenager at this time when Magnum. I was in high school, or it was right after high school. When Magnum TA had that wreck, he wrecked his Porsche and all that stuff, man. Bad things that happened to Magnum TA, and probably later on he would have been a world champion, but I just don't think he was the man to actually take Ric Flair out. But somebody did come along later on that had what he had and just had a little bit more than what he had. But Magnum TA, he did. He had all the tools and all that, but it was something about him that he couldn't overcome to take out Ric Flair at that time. But he probably was. He was younger than Ric Flair. He still is. He's still around. Younger than Ric Flair and everything like that. And he probably was going to get the title, take the title and go on a run. Probably a couple years after that, after he had the wreck, and he probably would have been the champion for a long time. I don't know. But next, man, we had him in a feud with Ronnie Garvin. Ronnie Garvin ended up beating Ric Flair and had, I think, a 40-day run as the champion or whatever, a little bit over a month. It seemed like it was a lot longer than that because Ric Flair had this title for a long time, and it seemed very weird for somebody to come in and win that championship. And and it was Ronnie Garvin, and I mean, to see this man holding that title for as long as he did, it seemed like it was a lot longer than what it was. But Ronnie Garvin gave Ric Flair a good run, hard-hitting match, and Ronnie Garvin don't get the credit that he deserves when it boils down to it. And he gets a lot of hatred for it to tell you the truth, he gets a lot of hatred for it, and it's probably a lot of it is unwarranted. It's unwarranted. So he probably don't deserve what he's getting. I mean, I hate it. I really do hate it for Ronnie Garvin. I really do. But that was the 12th. That was the 12th feud that built the Nature Boy Ric Flair. The next one was Lex Luger. He went on a feud with Lex Luger, and I mean, that thing went over several years. And Lex Luger, big, strong, had the look and all that. Just had a hard time trying to overcome the Nature Boy. Very hard time trying to overcome the Nature Boy. Only reason he ended up getting the title is because of Sting. I think ended up getting injured, and Ric Flair went ahead and dropped the title to him, or something like that. Or was going to drop the title to him. I think he did. And I think he wanted to drop it to Barry Windham, who was a much better wrestler than Lex Luger. But Lex Luger, he had the persona. He had everything, the build, and as far as the look to be the world champion and everything like that. So to me, he was a viable champion. He was a viable champion. I can look at him and say, okay, he's the world champion. He was a better wrestler than say somebody like Wardlow today. I mean, he was better than what people give him credit for. And even though he wasn't the greatest talker, he wasn't a Ric Flair on the microphone. He wasn't an Arn Anderson on the microphone. He wasn't a Roddy Piper. Some of these great guys who had come through. Let me look at some of the other great guys who knew how to talk. Ole Anderson, Chief Wahoo McDaniel was pretty good on the microphone. Some of the Von Erich brothers, Tully Blanchard was great on the mic. Some of these guys probably, Ronnie Garvin wasn't bad on the mic, but he won the world title. But some of these guys had, should have, Magnum TA was a little bit better than Lex on the mic. But, as far as Lex did pretty good on the mic with what he had. And, Lex used to like to display his body and things like that. And he seemed real. He seemed real. It seemed legit. Because, how big and powerful he was. So the things he said seemed legit. So I got to give him a little bit more due. He deserves his due, man. He was decent on the mic. for what it was. Let's just put it that way. Next, man. Next after Lex Luger, he had a feud with Ricky Morton. I don't think this thing. Ric Flair said he wrestled hundreds of times. Don't seem like that to me. Seemed like Ric Flair beat this kid up for 2 to 3 months, man, and that was it. Ricky Morton fought and fought and fought, but Ric Flair was beating the living daylights out of Ricky Morton. But that was a huge feud, and Ricky Morton was a huge star. I mean, he was so big. The Rock and Roll Express was so big. And him against Ricky Morton fought his tail off. And that's something else that elevated Ric Flair, just elevated him. Last but not least, you know, and as far as in WCW, his biggest WCW feud was against Sting. And this thing was huge. Sting took over. Sting took what Magnum TA should have. When I seen that feud, I'm like, this is what Ric Flair and Magnum TA should have been. This is what Ric Flair and Magnum TA was going to elevate to. But it never happened with Ric Flair and Magnum TA. But Magnum TA's loss was, you know, Sting's gain. And Sting was able to finally defeat Flair. I think he defeated him a couple times for the world title. I'm not sure. Something like that. But, man, Ric Flair elevated Sting. Sting elevated who Ric Flair was. Great feud, man. One of the greatest feuds of all times out of Ric Flair's entourage of feuds. But this right here is the man that helped build the Nature Boy Ric Flair. And if you're enjoying this, man, hit that like, share, join if you're on Facebook. And like I say on YouTube, like, share, join, subscribe, hit that notification bell, man. Share this on YouTube. Man, let your friends know about the Straight Up Wrestling Show. And, man, right now I'm on the feuds. And, man, Ric Flair has so many great feuds. And without these feuds, Nature Boy Ric Flair wouldn't be who he is today. But these are 15 feuds, and I'm basically going from 1975 up to 1988. NWA, WCW, when, you know, first from the Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling area to when, you know, it was Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling and Jim Crockett Promotions to NWA, WCW. And then he sold it off to Ted Turner, but it's still WCW. And that Sting feud, Ric Flair feud continued on. But this right here, I'm basically going up to 1988, 1989, 1990. But let me go ahead and it's 15, these 15 wrestlers in these 15 feuds right here. And I'm going to talk about Wahoo McDaniel, number 1. Number 2 feud he had was against Ricky Steamboat. Number 3 feud was against the Anderson brothers. Number 4 feud was against Greg Valentine. Number 5 feud was against Roddy Piper. Number 6 feud was against Dusty Rhodes. Number 7 feud was against Harley Race. The number 8 feud was against David Carey and Kevin Von Erich. The number 9 feud was against Nikita Koloff. The number 10 feud was against Tully Blanchard. Number 11 feud was against Magnum TA. The number 12 feud was against Ronnie Garvin. The number 13 feud was against Lex Luger. The number 14 feud was against Ricky Morton. Number 15 was against Sting. And now I'm going to go ahead and talk about some honorable mentions, because the thing what made Ric Flair so great, when he had these feuds, it just wasn't, he was just wrestling these feuds. Ric Flair had outstanding matches in between these feuds. Ric Flair had many feuds with people while he was feuding with these other big name stars. He had many feuds that he was taking care of. So he was wrestling great wrestlers in feuds in between these feuds. So I'm going to give an honorable mention to some of these other feuds, but Ric Flair, that's one thing about him. Like, he could be, and Ric Flair will be in a feud with Chief Wahoo McDaniel, and he'll be feuding with Paul Jones, or have a mini feud with Paul Jones and Mr. Wrestling 1, Tim Woods, Mr. Wrestling Tim Woods, in between that feud, and still be feuding with Chief Wahoo McDaniel. Then he will be feuding with Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, and in between that, he will still be feuding with Wahoo McDaniel, Paul Jones. I mean, that's what made him so great. And when he was feuding with the Anderson brothers, you know, he was feuding, when he was feuding with the Anderson brothers, he was feuding with Blackjack Mulligan and still Chief Wahoo McDaniel. Then when he went to Greg Valentine, he was feuding with Greg Valentine. He was feuding with Roddy Piper at the time when he was going against Greg Valentine, and out there wrestling Harley Race and Andre the Giant. So this man had so many people that helped him out in between his feuds, he still was in big, huge matches in between those feuds. That's what made him so great and so outstanding, is that he had these great mini feuds in between the big feuds. He wasn't just concentrating on these big feuds. He had these mini feuds, and that's something that you don't see today. That I didn't see from a whole lot of other wrestlers that had these outstanding mini feuds in between the big feuds that they had. And Ric Flair is about the only one that I ever seen do that. And Hardy Race did it on to a certain point too. But Ric Flair had that, and that's what made his feud so great, because he had those mini feuds in between. Okay, let me go and give some honorable mentions to some of the feuds that I did not mention as far as the top 15 feuds. But honorable mention, Terry Funk. Terry Funk came in. We know what happened. Terry Funk, after he beat Ricky Steamboat in one of the greatest matches ever, and most people look at it as the greatest match to conclude the feud. I think it happened in '89. And Terry Funk, he challenged Ric Flair for the title. Ric Flair went off on him, told him, well, Terry, you've been in Hollywood and all that, and I've been going all around the world, defending this title and all that. And basically, Ric Flair was saying other people deserve a shot before you deserve a shot, because you ain't even in the rankings. You haven't been out here paying your dues. You haven't been out here working. Why do you deserve this shot? So and Terry Funk attacked him and pretty much dumped him on the table. Did power driver on the table. Table didn't break. That was when those tables, they didn't have them breakable tables like they have now and things like that. Man, it was very vicious, and it went off really well. And then they had their feud, which Ric Flair overcame that. Another feud, like say Tiger Conway Jr. Tiger Conway Jr. in 1975. I think it was 1975 or either 77, but I think 75, 76, 77. He kept having a feud. He kept feuding a little bit with Tiger Conway Jr. Tiger Conway's father was there, but Ric Flair and Tiger Conway Jr. same age, and those guys went at it with each other a good bit back in the Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling area. And a lot of back then, a lot of black people really was backing Tiger Conway Jr. Black guy, had his afro and everything, really, had it all. And I mean, great wrestler. His dad was a great wrestler. So Ric Flair against Tiger Conway Jr., that was a great feud. And pretty much that feud got hot and heavy sometimes. But he had those feud. He had a feud with Tiger Conway Jr. Most of his feuds with him was in between, like in between the Wahoo McDaniel or Ricky Steamboat, the big feuds that he was having. He was having with Tiger Conway Jr. But it was a great feud. It really was. So next, man, we had Ric Flair against Bobo Brazil. Bobo Brazil came through the Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling area quite a few times back in the 70s. He always ended up in a feud with the Nature Boy Ric Flair. Pretty good feud. As I recall, they had a good series of matches. Next feud he had was against a guy who was his tag team partner a lot, a guy who built him up, a guy who put him on a pedestal, Blackjack Mulligan. Ric Flair and Blackjack Mulligan had some vicious matches. So that right there, man, was that was a memorable feud. A lot of people remember that. Next, he really wasn't a feud. I think it was a one-off. And the Nature Boy Buddy Rogers. I know a lot of people out here call it a feud, say it was a feud or whatever, but it was pretty much feuding over the Nature Boy name. Nature Boy Buddy Rogers, the one who started that and all that. He wore like a vest type thing. He didn't wear the big robes, but he had the little dance, walk, and everything. Ric Flair, pretty much copied that. I mean, George Scott, when Ric Flair came back from the plane crash, he changed who Ric Flair was and gave him that gimmick, and Ric Flair ran with it and made it bigger than what Buddy Rogers did. But Buddy Rogers was pretty big back in the 60s when he was doing it. In the 50s he was doing it. Buddy Rogers, and then Buddy Rogers and Ric Flair, and Buddy was kind of, he was up there in age. But him and Ric Flair had a pretty good match, but Ric Flair ended up taking him out. Loved the match. I'll never forget it when I was younger. And I think I watched that. I was in 5th grade at the time, 5th or 6th grade. I think it was that when Ric Flair and Buddy Rogers wrestled. I'll never forget that. And I hated it. I hated it for Buddy Rogers. I thought he was old. I didn't think it was fair. And, and I was like, man, because I think it was the gimmick that what got Ric Flair over. I like the gimmick. At that time, I was like, is it Ric Flair that I like, or is it the gimmick? I love the gimmick. And Buddy Rogers was doing that, and he wasn't fake. He was the original. So, I kind of was rooting for him. Even though I was rooting for the Nature Boy Ric Flair, I was rooting for Buddy Rogers in this too. Mr. Wrestling Tim Woods, probably one of the greatest wrestlers I ever seen in my life. Mr. Wrestling Tim Woods, you know, sometimes he would come in masked up, and sometimes he just wrestled as Tim Woods. But he wore a white mask and everything like that, and sometimes he didn't. But Mr. Wrestling Tim Woods had a series against Ric Flair. Mr. Wrestling Tim Woods, he was known for one of these guys that could break any wrestling hold. You know, he could break any wrestling hold. Great wrestler, but him and Ric Flair has a great series of matches. And Ric Flair had an outstanding feud with this next man. He should be in this as Jimmy Snuka, Jimmy Superfly Snuka. And that was in between some of the feuds, but he had a huge feud with Jimmy Superfly Snuka, who came into the Mid-Atlantic area, I think, in 78, 79. Yeah, he was 78. He came in, him and Paul Orndorff. Jimmy Snuka and Paul Orndorff quickly won the NWA World Tag Team Championships. But in between that, him and Ric Flair had an outstanding feud. Some bloody matches went down between Ric Flair and Jimmy Superfly Snuka. But man, basically that's it. I didn't think it was going to go this far. But next on this series, this is a series. The man that helped build the Nature Boy Ric Flair. This is the first part of the series. Next, man, I'm going to be talking about the man that formed the Nature Boy Ric Flair. So I'm going to talk about the man that surrounded Nature Boy Ric Flair during his career, his whole career. He had a lot of people that surrounded him and that boosted him up, that made him look bigger than life. You know, not just promoters, not just Jimmy Crockett. It wasn't just Jim Crockett and David Crockett and Vince McMahon. It was other wrestlers that built this man up and put him on a pedestal and put him out in front and made him look like he was just this major superstar, this major player. And so it wasn't just Ric Flair. It wasn't just Ric Flair. It was a lot of people that was involved that built him into the superstar that he became. And we will be talking about that next on the man that helped build the Nature Boy Ric Flair. And for the Straight Up Wrestling Show, man, my man Christopher Burton, the People's Podcaster, is not with me on this. This is something that I'm going on about because, like I say, I watched him didn't get to watch him from day one because he started in 1972 over in the AWA, in which I started watching wrestling around that time, at 5-6 years old, maybe 6 or 7. But I was watching Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, which had George Sandy Scott, Nelson Royal, and people like that. This was before Ric Flair had got there. And, they did have Rip Hawk and all that. And then Ric Flair came. He was a tag team partner with Rip Hawk. But Ric Flair is one of the main players that helped me start watching wrestling and that took a major interest, that made me take a major interest in it. Outside of, like, say, Wahoo McDaniel, who, like, say, first time I really watched a match really fully was when he really watched the match and just paid attention to it like crazy, was when he knocked Boris Malenko's teeth out of his mouth, man, which was flat crazy. But Ric Flair, like I say, then he ended up hitting Wahoo with that 2x4 and then brass knucks, man. I will never forget that. But man, thanks for tuning in. And once again, man, hit that like, share, join on Facebook, YouTube, whatever you got to do. And I will be getting this thing up on Twitter and Twitch. But man, for the Straight Up Wrestling Show, I'm HBT Harry Bernard Taylor, saying peace. Stay straight up. Okay, everybody, I had ended that video of the biggest feuds that Ric Flair had, the feuds that he had, and I didn't include Barry Windham. So that's somebody I didn't include. Barry Windham, I should have included him after Devon Ericks. He had a feud with Barry Windham, and that feud was a very good feud, and that's something that definitely should have been included on this. I can say honorable mentions, but that feud should be in there in the top 15. So basically, I'm just going to go and say, just throw him in there. Definitely Barry Windham. He had a very good feud with Barry Windham, and they went several 90-minute matches. He went 90-minute matches with Barry Windham, and that's probably one of the best feuds that he ever had. I mean, I ranked that up there with Steamboat. I mean, those were some great matches that he had with Barry Windham, who later became one of the guys in the Four Horsemen. But Barry Windham is somebody, man, that definitely needs to be recognized for the feuds that he had with Ric Flair, because they was big. They was huge. Barry Windham is definitely the man who could have took the title off Ric Flair. So let me add that in there. But besides all that, man, stay straight up, and I enjoyed you. I appreciate you joining in, checking this out. Thank you.